All right, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for Bolin's presentation on NDI-powered production. Now, yesterday we talked about a lot of Bolin's products and how the NDI features built into them are able to power a lot of productions. And today we're going to talk about some actual productions in real life that are using Bolin with the power of NDI. Now, the number one place where Bolin's application of NDI-enabled cameras comes in is to solve the challenge with traditional broadcast workflows. Now, we're going to go over 3 separate case studies today that are all using various forms of NDI and Bolin cameras in order to solve some serious problems that they face. Now, we'll talk about how these are across sports, corporate, and performing arts. And the question, there's a single thread that develops between all 3 of them. How do you deliver a broadcast quality experience without the budget or the complexity of a full traditional broadcast? And truly, this is where NDI comes in to solve a lot of the questions. Instead of running a dedicated SDI or HDMI feed to those destinations where you have a lot of expenses or you don't have the means to run a lot of cabling, or adding multiple rounds of cabling to duplicate what a single feed is able to do. Now, NDI, fortunately, is able to solve this challenge both in full IP as well as hybrid workflows through the capabilities of NDI and the flexibility of Bolin cameras. So, like I said, we're going to talk about 3 different venues. They had 3 different challenges that they had to overcome, and there was one single answer that repeatedly provided the solution, and it was NDI. Both NDI High Bandwidth and NDI HX3 across Bolin's indoor and outdoor cameras that answer these questions. Now, a nice added feature was an NDI Embedded Bridge, which allowed them to also eliminate the use for additional hardware, where they could just have the camera do a lot of the heavy lifting required and send their video feeds to remote destinations. One of the nice things also, and we'll touch on this a little bit further, is the fact that Bolin's cameras were NDI certified, which gave them the comfort of knowing that they were going to be below a certain latency threshold that was relevant for a particular case. And in one of them, Bolin's IP67 rig cameras really came and solved the problem. So we're going to start with the first of these case studies, which is Harvard University. Now, at IBC, we're talking about NDI's 10th year anniversary, and it's really fitting that we start with Harvard because they were one of the first adopters of NDI technology. They already owned a TriCaster, and when NDI was introduced, they enabled that functionality in their TriCasters. They produced 325 games annually across 42 sports teams on a single campus. Like I mentioned, they were an early adopter of NDI. They've used it since its introduction in 2015, and they have over 150 NDI sources on their network, in addition to another 30 or so receivers. So it's safe to say that they're very comfortable with NDI. And so when it came to the latest fields that they were working with, they had a couple of challenges. One, they needed to cover multiple sports fields and get multiple angles, all timed equally, with professional video quality. Their current solution was to use handheld cameras. Oftentimes, they would send a student up on a scissor lift behind the field and say to record the game, which provided some unsafe practices. Budget and safety is, of course, a concern. And because they're a university who's enabling their students to do the production, what they needed to figure out was, of course, how to handle the safety, but also these students are also juggling their class workloads in addition to the actual production challenges that they faced. And so how do they get a variety of different sources in a single space where they can have a single operator do multiple jobs? And at every step of the way, NDI was the answer. Now, getting to the solution was a little bit more difficult because while Bolin had NDI cameras, they had tons of different choices when it came to which cameras were the right ones for their location. Well, they needed to figure out this is an outdoor location. We're in Boston, which gets as cold as -5 Fahrenheit. So they needed a camera that could survive the outdoor elements, one that could be permanently installed so they didn't have to constantly go up a pole that was about 50 meters in the air, and how they could have reliable operation throughout all of this. And so what they ultimately decided on was Bolin's EX Ultra 230NX cameras. What this allowed them to do is mount multiple cameras throughout their field One of the big advantages of choosing Bolin is, in addition to all the feature sets we had, it came at a competitive price point where instead of purchasing one really high-end camera, they were able to purchase six across their fields, which again gave them more flexibility and more angles to work with. What it also meant is they had a reliable broadcast grade image quality across their network. When they installed their original NDI network in 2015, they were using the basic NDI standard, which we now know as NDI high bandwidth. And they faced some troubles with this, managing their network workload. And so when NDI-HX was introduced, that significantly helped their production. However, recently NDI-HX3 was introduced, which provided some additional benefits. Their infrastructure at the time and their camera sources at the time only supported NDI-HX2. And so when they installed Bolin's cameras, currently they're using NDI-HX2, but Bolin's cameras have not just HX2, but HX3 built into it. So as they're upgrading their networks, they're able to then transition to NDI-HX3 using the same hardware. So they now have a reliable piece of hardware that they can scale with as their productions grow. And the main message from Harvard, as they best put it, is NDI isn't an experiment for them. It's been proven over the last decade to be an effective method of production. It's long proven, and using Bolin's cameras as their latest weapon in their arsenal strengthened their ability to do more with production with less resources. So moving on from sports production, let's talk about a corporate example of how NDI is being used. So we'll go over to Barcelona at the Barcelona Bar Association. They had an old historic auditorium, over a 100-year-old building. Then they needed to modernize for conferences, hybrid events, and image magnification, or IMAG. The biggest challenge they faced is they had a very strict architectural restraint. They could only run a limited number of cables, they could only mount in certain locations. And so they needed to be able to have a long zoom range. They needed to be able to minimize the amount of cabling and work in low light applications where they have varying lighting conditions for various productions and conferences that they have place. And they wanted to do it with as minimal staff on site as possible, as across the broadcast industry, we noticed that there are a reduced amount of funding for these productions. And so what they were able to do is utilize several of Bolin's R9-230NX cameras installed throughout the venue. Now, the R9-230, as we talked about yesterday, is a full HD camera with 30x zoom range. So when they were going from the back of their auditorium, they were able to zoom in to get some very tight shots. In addition to that, it was a single cable that was doing network, that was providing power, that was providing the audio and the video signal all going through. And Bolin has the embedded bridge, and so it allowed a single operator from the comfort of their home to be able to adjust these camera angles and monitor the action and follow what was happening on the stage. The other advantage of Bolin's R9-230 is its 1/1.8-inch sensor, which was able to provide extreme low light capabilities. So even in a dim venue that had varying lighting conditions, they were able to adjust their needs to meet, to have their visuals match the quality of presentations that were happening on stage. They were able to introduce hybrid elements to this as well and engage remotely with the attendees who may not be able to come in person. And so they were able to preserve the historic integrity of that room while still delivering a modern AV experience that people come to expect with live streams and productions. And lastly, we'll talk about, this is our most recent one that we published, is the Glyndebourne Opera House in the UK. This is a historic venue, about a 150-year-old opera house that exists in the countryside outside of London. And they traditionally had an analog system where they ran SDI cables to all of their various camera positions for their conductor camera system. So historically, their conductor and a handful of orchestra members would sit in an orchestra pit, but there were several people backstage, as well as additional musicians backstage, who needed to be able to pick up on audio cues. So latency was a very critical portion of their upgrade experience. Now, they had previously tried NDI in the past, along with other AV over IP technologies. And what they had found is the latency was just far too high for them to be able to use it in a live music environment where hitting the note at the exact right time was a critical step in this process. And so fortunately, they reached out to one of our installers, and they originally were going to go with an NDI system. An SDI system, as they already had SDI cable running throughout the facility. So our installer recommended to them, why don't you try out the R9 418N that has not just the SDI outputs, but the NDI capabilities built into it as well, where you can use the SDI capabilities for immediate needs and then have the speed distributed throughout the facility with NDI as a signal. And so they bought a couple of cameras and decided to give it a shot. And what they discovered is, due to the powerful FPGAs inside of Bolin's R9 cameras, they were able to use just the NDI signal, not the SDI signal at all, to be able to route the NDI high bandwidth signal with its low latency, not just to their conductor through their conductor camera system, but also their stage operation teams to hit certain lighting cues, as well as their green rooms and stage management teams, who all had the same video feed being routed to them that they could maintain across the network. So now, instead of being tied down to a single location where the SDI feeds were being run to, they could move their monitors with them wherever they were moving across stage and have that flexibility to move around in this environment. Now, they still decided to connect the SDI as a redundancy in this operation, but they were able to use the NDI signal with the low light capabilities of Bolin's cameras to deliver a world-class cinematic experience without impacting their live performance experience at all. They were able to develop a scalable model for future productions that help scale faster and easier and make life for the production team a lot easier. So as we talked about across all three of these case studies, there were three very different industries: sports broadcast, corporate production, and live production. But they had the same challenges: cost, flexibility, quality, and reliability. And so through Bolin's implementation of NDI high bandwidth, HX3, and embedded bridge in its product line, they were able to prove the longevity of the camera, the flexibility in restricted spaces, the low latency performances where it mattered, and develop the trust across all of these various industries. So this is the core message through Bolin's camera lines that are all enabled with NDI. No matter the application, no matter the location, no matter the destination, Bolin has cameras that are able to provide the right solution for the right people at the right cost. And that is a quick look at some of the applications that Bolin, along with NDI, are able to achieve. Thank you.